welcome. It's nice to have a crowd come out here in Thompson. I'm really pleased to be able to come here and share some of the story of the Old Connecticut Path with you. This project started about 3-4 years ago because of my family history. It started as a family history project, and I've been fortunate that my family, my uncle, did the family history, the genealogy of the Newton family, and if you're a Dimmick family member or connection, you did the Dimmicks, and they came through Connecticut very early. And among those who came to Connecticut very early was Reverend Thomas Hooker. And Thomas Hooker and his wife Susannah, their daughter Mary Hooker, married my immigrant ancestor Roger Newton, who was studying for the ministry. I came over from starting the studies at Cambridge University in 1636. Transferred, if you will, to that new school they called Cambridge when it first opened in 1638, and met Thomas Hooker at Cambridge in what is now that other place. If you donate a little money to a school very early, they'll name it for you. And in 1640, Roger Newton traveled down from Cambridge to Hartford and lived in the home of Thomas and Susannah Hooker to finish his preparation for the ministry. And as the story goes, from there, love took over, and he later married Mary Hooker, Thomas and Susannah's second daughter. So really the Newton history goes back directly to some of the founders of Connecticut. And as I did this project, I didn't realize, I'm going to move a little bit out of the way here, I didn't realize how many people I have in this connection to Connecticut. And it's all through my grandparents, Lydia Dimmick and Irwin Newton, when they married. The Newtons and the Dimmicks traveled up the Connecticut Valley from Connecticut up to Vermont. Their ancestors traveled to Connecticut from the Bay, Massachusetts Bay, and from the Plymouth Colony. So they have a lot of Mayflower connections and other connections. And just going through and saying, how many people are you related to when you get 11 generations out? I would have somewhere in the range of over 500 however many greats-grandparents. And if I went back to Thomas Hooker, it would be over 1,000. So I literally am finding that I'm related to many of the people that are in the room when I go out and do a presentation, that I have a lot of cousins out there that connect with this story. And some of them I found, a group here, since I was targeting in on the 3 towns that were the core of those early years in Connecticut of Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield, that there were a core of about 15 or so of the founders that are my great-great-grandparents. And that's just the Windsor group. There's a large number of other of my greats that came to Connecticut and were tied to its history, and also were part of the westward expansion. They came to Connecticut, and their families took root here, and then moved on up the Connecticut Valley and out across the west, up the Mohawk Valley and out across the country. So there's a strong connection in my family history back to Connecticut and the folks who came down the Connecticut Path. And there's a strong connection to people I'm finding all across the country who their ancestors may have come at that time among the founders of Connecticut. So since all the genealogical work was done, I took on the task of trying to figure out, well, gee, how did they just go? I figured it'd be pretty easy to figure out because it should be one of those things that there's all sorts of markers, placards, books, and things. And I really didn't find anything clear that said, here's where it went. It seemed to have been kind of a forgotten topic. So in looking at this, I really started looking at the path as it ran from the green in front of Harvard University, where they gathered to, Thomas Hooker and his congregation gathered to come to Connecticut, on down to the Connecticut River there, and they're crossing the Connecticut to Hartford. Try and figure out, is there a way that it could be done? And in this process, I was trying to answer some questions. Can we put together or figure out a coherent route that might have been followed? And as we go out and look along that path, are there places that we can go that have that wilderness sense, that this was a great wilderness at their time, that was known intimately by the natives, but would have been a totally foreign experience for the English coming down here? So are there places that you could find that you get that sense of what it might have been like? And because this is a route that early settlers, pioneers followed, and then later settlers who came to live in this area took root in, are there artifacts along the way that we can see today? So those were some of the questions that I had in this process. And let me see if I get this to work. Okay. And I said, as we look back at time, and this is a map from 1660, the interior of New England was largely unmapped and pretty much unknown. They were entering into the wilderness. And there was a path, and there may have been several branches and intersecting paths that ran with it, so that depending on the conditions, they could move from one direction to the other. But there was a route that was followed by the natives and then later used by the pioneers from Cambridge on down to Connecticut Valley. And there's some visions that, you look at the history of the story of the Connecticut Path, the folks coming down, that range in the story that Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, in the 1700s wrote, this party, they left Cambridge, and Thomas Hooker had the compass in his hand, and he was walking through the wilderness, and they sort of like they didn't really know how to get here, but by the miracle of God, they found their way in 2 weeks through all the bushes to Connecticut. And then there's this other more romanticized kind of view that shows up in paintings and later tellings of the story, that it was almost like a kind of picnic walk in the park. And the reality of it would be not quite what Hutchinson said, and then not quite as it's depicted in paintings, that they were following native trails and likely had native guides so they wouldn't get lost, and probably were looking for ways that would be safe, because we have to remember a time before bridges, roads, and other things that came later that made travel a lot easier. So they were traveling on foot. They had horses to help carry the burdens, but it was a foot trail, and they were traveling through the wilderness. And this would be something that would be totally foreign to them, so they needed help. Now, fortunately, it's a powerful story, and as I started looking into it, as you follow the route of the path, it's part of the history of the towns along the way, that they have over time erected monuments and markers from their local traditions of the importance of this group that went down to Connecticut and it being part of their history. And I have been able to, and I'll share it real quickly, you can put together what looks to be a fairly coherent route running from Cambridge on down to Connecticut that you could follow fairly closely today. And looking at this, I had to figure that
driving cattle, they probably were going about 10 miles a day on foot. So if we break it up, their first day out of Cambridge would have been just a little bit out beyond Route 128, which those of us, I come from outside of Worcester, anything, when you live in Massachusetts, anything outside of 128 is still considered the wilderness. That we're a separate country from inside 128. From there on down to Framingham, to Whitehall Pond, which is a beautiful place down in Hampton, and there's some history that that was one of the camping places of the Hooker party. On down to Sutton, day 5 down in the Webster area, Webster-Dudley area, then on to Woodstock, across the Pine Hill in Ashford, and then down to the Willimantic River. And then from there, across Holland and down to Vernon, with some branches for those who were going to Windsor, and down to the crossing in Hartford. And for those of you who've been down Route 84 and you get to the bridge down there on Route 84 going over to Hartford, the story is that's right about the area where the first crossing was of the Connecticut River. And there's a sandbar there, and before they dredged it out, it was even higher level that they probably were able to drive cattle across there and maybe use boats for themselves or canoes to get across. Now, during all of this process of research, I kept hearing about this guy, Robert Grady. And Bob Grady was here, and whatever happened to him as I came down into Connecticut. It took some time for me to finally track down the report by the Connecticut Historical Commission that Bob Grady compiled. And Grady is an archaeologist, was at the University of Connecticut, and he and graduate students and associates dug into the story of the path, the documentary evidence, the path's route, looking at the history and significance, and then made some recommendations for a National Register. And as I was looking at it, going, well, it would have been a whole lot easier for me if I'd known this rather than going out and stumbling through the woods to find it, because what I was able to find coming across Connecticut largely matched up with what they found. So in terms of blind study, I was blind in the woods doing this, and life would have been a lot easier had I known what they'd already discovered. But there were some differences too that I'll try to touch on. One of the differences and things that they brought up, and I had experienced also looking at the history, is that there seemed to be some parallel routes, and the one that I followed is the green line that I call kind of the highway that's up in the hills. And then there was a low way down in the valleys, which tended to follow right along 44 and into Hartford that way. They brought out an interesting point that those who were living early in the 1900s, late 1800s, in areas where native paths, Indian paths were still visible, distinguished that there were summer trails and winter trails. The summer trails tended to be down in the valley, and the winter trails were up on the hills. And they said, you know, the winter trails would be most likely to be the ones that we'd still find traces of, because the summer trails down in the valleys, a couple of things happened with, just naturally with flooding along the rivers, they'd be eradicated and would have to be recreated frequently. And they also became the areas where roads were built. So if we really want to find those kind of primitive traces of native trails, we have to go to the high country, which is what I was engaged in trying to find in my own search. And some of the best places that meet that provide that sense of wilderness, you'll find between Sutton up in Massachusetts and West Sutton, on down through your area across Wyndham County and on down to the Wilmington River. And I'll take a couple minutes to give you about I figure this is about 3 days worth of pictures, so I'll just talk while the little slideshow goes here. If I can get it to, come on, there we go. Starting up in Sutton, the Manchog Indian village, and this history of the trail really starts up in the area of Waters Farm, and it's a gorgeous place that the Manchog Pond Association and the Waters Farm Foundation and the town of Sutton are really working to preserve. And from there you lead right into a 3-mile walk through wilderness where there are no road crossings. And it's hard to imagine that here in this part of the country that you can have a walk through a wilderness in the Douglas Woods between Sutton and on down to Webster. And along the way you do get these traces of settlement that probably was later than their passage, but this whole area by history was a native hunting ground. And later you see these traces of stonework that show that it was a route later in time as settlement was occurring here. And we skip across Webster to Dudley here, and there's conservation land right along the rail corridor in Dudley that shows, again, those artifacts of early settlers coming through, and is along this route. And it's now accessible as a wild area. As we come into Thompson, in the area of Cordis Hill, we come down along and we follow Shunway Brook and down across the trails that run along the river to the place of the crossing, the likely area of the crossing of the path. And as you will see a little more closely as we come back to this, the trail goes across the Thompson Woods to Woodstock. Woodstock has been very active over the past century, their historical society, in helping to identify and gain recognition for the path and Pulpit Rock, and leading Walktober walks along the path, and gaining recognition as part of the National Register of Historic Places for the Old Connecticut Path. And it's truly a beautiful place to go and walk and explore, and we'll have more of this. This is a teaser. But from there we head into the wilderness, and there's some wonderfully wild places that still are there as we get into Eastford at Crystal Pond, and go west beyond Mule Orchard on these old paths that are still there along the route of the Old Connecticut Path, into Yale Forest, and seeing signs of the massive effort of the early settlers and the routes that they took. In Nahacko Forest, we have some really marvelous wilderness that takes you deep into the woods in an area that the Historical Commission found was part of the path, leading to one of the monuments along the trail. I'm going to pause right here. This one is now at the Connecticut Historical Society, and that was where the path crossed the Nahacko River. But as we go up over Westford Hill, you begin to see, and this is just a teaser, I'll give you a little bit more as we go on, this sense of wilderness and the high ground, the winter trail that leads across Windham County and on into Wilmington. And as we go up the final ridge, up to Wilmington Hill, along the Curtis Brook, we'll come over the hill and you start to head down to the Willimantic River. Now we've taken, just about to the Willimantic here, we've taken about 3 or 4 minutes to do this. Think in terms of 10 miles a day on foot, that would be, say, 3 days across there, and leading down to the Willimantic River. So that's a teaser. It's out there, and the beauty of it is that up there in the hills, just as the Connecticut Historic Commission identified, and our paths really tracked pretty closely, the high country, the winter trails are likely to be the ones that we might find that would give some indication of what travel was like, because the ones in the valleys have been lost and been paved over in our time. So you have a real treasure up there in the hills. And as part of this process, I started trying to find the places. And then I had to say, well, what do I know about the people? Because clearly this was a challenge to go across. It was a challenge to find. It would be an incredible walk if we said, let's get together and walk it. It'd be an incredible walk, but you'd be fairly tired by the end. But really to encounter or face my own black hole on colonial history. Because as I was growing up, and I'm sure you can relate with this, we have this thing in American history where around Thanksgiving we all cut out turkeys, we talk about the Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrims, and that's our first bit of American history, and then usually American history jumps to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and then we jump on, and pretty soon, by the time we get about up to World War II, the year is over, and we say, well, throw up our hands. But there's a big gap in what we don't know in that time between the arrival of those first immigrants and our independence and the American Revolution. The story of the path really is intimately tied with my ancestor and Thomas Hooker. Is one of the people that we can follow that we actually have a good bit of history about and story of in his coming down to Connecticut and how powerfully this has affected, his life affected the course of America. As a scholar, he's still being studied. As a minister, he was a profoundly powerful minister. He was a reformer within his time. And in our history, when we talk about founders, he's among those who are considered founder of Hartford and founder of Connecticut. The New England Confederation, one of the first attempts to bring the colonies together to share in joint efforts in areas of common concern. A statesman who was called upon to mediate and solve problems that were occurring in the colonies. And a big one is this father of American democracy. And going back in his story, a key place in his life, back in England, was in Chelmsford, where he was the lecturer from 1626 to 1629. Chelmsford was, as I'm finding out, was in Essex, was a hotbed of Puritan belief, a strong Puritan following, and Hooker, by virtue of the power of his ability to take teachings from Scripture and bring them down into the lives of a way that people could incorporate in their lives in practical terms, he was described as there was no one comparable to him. No one excelled him in his ability to persuade and explain. So he drew increasingly large crowds to hear and take part in the beliefs that changes needed to occur in the practice of religion in England and the Puritan movement that was forming to bring about those changes. And during that time, he lived with his family at Cuckoo's Farm, and that was in Little Bay, just outside of Chelmsford. And here, during this time, Hooker was meeting and the young ministers, up-and-coming ministers, were coming out to meet with him in groups at the Cuckoo's Farm. And among the ministers that was there was, who later played a role in the path in the history of New England, was Reverend John Elliott, who came to live with the Hooker family and later came to Massachusetts and became the apostle for the Indians, translated the Bible to Algonquin, and was their greatest advocate in some very difficult times. But they lived together at the Cuckoo's Farm. So Hooker was influencing the people by his lectures, and more importantly, he was influencing the leadership of the ministers in England as they came and sought him out and had these great discussions about changes in religion and what that would translate to in a more just society. They were up against two powerful forces. King Charles was not tolerant of diversion from the strict Church of England views. And he set this out. Basically, you're not going to be tolerated, that there will be severe consequences, because the church and the state actually were tied together. So a challenge to the church was a challenge to his authority in this kingdom. He had a loyal enforcer in William Laud. And Laud in his life had a number of things that he did which were positives, which for this audience and this purpose I won't go into. But he did play a large role in the suppression of the Puritan ministry and the Puritan movement. And he used his power because Hooker became a threat by his ministry and by his influence on the ministers, that he suppressed and removed Hooker from his ministry. And when Hooker was continuing to meet with the ministers, he then had him called before a high tribunal for treason and heresy. And Hooker was advised to leave the country, because if you were, in this time before habeas corpus, they could throw you in jail for a long period of time. You might not come out. And one of my other ancestors, who was also a minister at that time, was thrown in jail for 2 years, 10 months for heresy, and was found to be so dangerous that the only way they'd let him out would be if he left the country. So clearly the Puritan movement, when we talk about there being a threat, they were perceived as a great threat. And when Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, folks said things aren't going to change, they're only going to get worse. And so there was a great migration to Massachusetts by the Puritans and the movement to New England. Now before Hooker left, he came back to England after 3 years of exile. And before he left, he had a final sermon where he foretold of a war that would be coming. And it did come after he left, and a great many others left England, the English Civil War. It was a terrible war. And the consequences of that, it really wasn't just a religious war, it was involved in the economy, they were having hard times, there was political factions, but it wound up having an effect of setting in motion changes in England that reshaped England and had roots in the American Revolution. Two things that came out of this direct products, William Laud, when the Puritans did finally come to power, was executed. And King Charles, the king, was executed. So now think about Puritans coming to America from their oppression with the heritage of a group of Puritans standing up to the loyalists and the king being overthrown, and how that might play out in our own history. They traveled 2 months on the Griffin to come to America, and they had a summer passage, so we'd say life below ship was probably a whole lot better than those who came in the winter. And they arrived, Hooker arrived to become minister of the group that came over before him and called themselves the Hooker Company, even before he got here. They were waiting for Thomas Hooker to come as their minister. And within 3 years, they packed their bags. They were looking for a place. They decided the Merrimack Valley was not far enough away from Massachusetts. And they left, and John Winthrop, the governor, wrote that Mr. Hooker left for Connecticut at the end of May, driving 160 cattle, so that's where we know, well, if you're driving cattle, it's going to be slow. And they walked. And that story is enshrined on the Connecticut State Capitol, the journey of Hooker's march to Connecticut. And much has been made, when I looked at this, that Susannah was this invalid, that she was carried, and that she was just a weak person or something. And I have to say, this is that, just as by way of background for the ladies in the group here and for the rest of us, that I found that Susannah Hooker had young children. She had a baby boy in November of 1633. Remember, they arrived in September of 1633. So imagine being below ship for 2 months, crossing the North Atlantic in your middle term of your pregnancies, and she endured a lot to come to Connecticut and come to the New World as a parent. And Thomas and Susannah came as parents, and they had 5 children that were with them in the journey. 3 of them were below 6 years. 6-year-old Sarah, 5-year-old John, and 2-year-old Samuel. So she had a reason to maybe have some help coming down to Connecticut. Once they got here, the journey west is one story of this start of our own westward expansion and migration west as part of our American heritage. But they also did something really remarkable in that in 1638, Thomas Hooker was called upon, the role of the minister was one of the leader in the community. He was called upon to speak about the formation of a government. And he chose a passage from Deuteronomy of choosing wise leaders. And there were some key things that he spoke of, and we have a record of his sermon, that the choice of magistrates belong to the people, and that's really establishing that it's the people who rule. And he was emphatic in that this was a gift from God to his people. And the second is the privilege of election should be exercised carefully. And looking at this in his context of people choosing and using their vote wisely, at that time votes might have been bought by bringing you into the tavern and giving you some ale or giving you small bribes. Now we've gotten much better at influencing people. But it was very clear in saying that because this is God's gift, you have to use that wisely in choosing your leaders, so that they look for the good of the congregation rather than their own, in our terms we'd say partisan gains. And then finally, and this was radical too at that time, of that people have the right to remove their officials if they don't meet their obligation. And the obligation that he saw was really that need for those leaders to be concerned for the good of the whole, of the community or the congregation. And that he had a right to remove them. There was no divine right, there was the people's right. And this was ratified, much discussion, the fundamental orders that were in the 375 years ago. It was ratified by the 3 towns, Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford. And it's considered the precursor, the grandfather of the American Constitution. And as we look at this, and I wasn't aware of this, I didn't grow up in Connecticut, so I didn't have this little history thing from, maybe they touched on it in your schools, that there was a marriage of covenants here, that the preamble, you read the preamble and you hear Thomas Hooker's words, that there's a connection that God has given you something special. The orders themselves were written, and we believe was probably influenced by Roger Ludlow from Windsor, define very specifically the rule of people, the protection of rights, powers that are limited. They were very concerned from their experience in England about abuse of power, and that it really needed to be ratified and endorsed by the people. And through this, every other colony had a charter that said, the king grants you authority to create a government. Here, there was no mention anywhere in the fundamental orders about the government, about the king. And from this, we really have, and you start reading the fundamental orders followed by the Declaration of Independence, and then the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution, you see that here was the precursor. So we could say that American Revolution didn't start in Lexington and Concord, it started much, much earlier. So here's the part, this was billed as, let's find out about Thompson, and where Thompson is on this. And I'm going to take you on a little treasure hunt, because there's a part of this that's just fun. And that's one of the things that, I hope that you will leave and say, it's hard to believe that history could be fun. especially after what we've gone through in school. You kind of have history drugged out of you if it's taught badly. But history can be fun, and treasure hunting can be a real part of the fun. And one of the things that I found in my travels and in my research is that there was someone who came before, in the person of Ellen Larned, who had a significant place in Thompson's history as the founder of the library and one of the first librarians, and as a historian in collecting the stories that she heard of the people who came and whose ancestors came to Windsor County. That was part of what she compiled in her history of Windsor County. And she really broke down a wall, and I've been down to the Connecticut Historical Society, and they have, if you contribute enough, you become a Ellen Larned member. That Ellen Larned broke down the barrier of a men's-only club in the Connecticut Historical Society as the first woman member. So as we see Ellen Larned and her history, it's tied to Thompson and the Connecticut Path in a way that is really quite remarkable. And I think in thinking about coming here tonight, I'm really pleased to be here at the Thompson Library to talk about Thompson's founder of the library, and this woman who broke through the barrier of men's-only club in history during Women's History Month. It can't get any better than that, but it does. That Ellen Larned tucked, and I looked in your library here, you don't have it in your book, your copy of the book here. Up at the Antiquarian Society in Worcester, I found tucked inside of the original edition was this thing called the Map of Ancient Windsor County, which if you haven't seen, it's really a treasure map. And on the map, this was Larned's work. She showed what she labeled as the Old Connecticut Path going right across the hills. And it tracks fairly closely with some of the places I'll share with you. A little bit larger here, you can see coming down from the line, this would be up into Dudley and on to Webster, and on down across Thompson and Woodstock, where Eastford is now at Crystal Pond, across Ashford and up to Westford Hill, and on down towards the Wilmington. So she took the stories and put them into some representation of about where she believed the path was. The other thing is you look at the map, and you can go on the website and look at it. It was before there were any roads, so you get to see what the old trails and places were called. And in doing this research, I've found that there are some really great public places that people can go on, and I went to some places where that part of the prayer, forgive us our trespasses. Because, I tried not to go on to places where they were posted and saying no trespassing, but a lot of the land is open for walking. But these are some of the public places that happen to be right along the path, which I hope as spring comes here, was it tomorrow at 12:30 something, and someone they'll wave the wand and it will be warm and nice, that you'll have some days in the time coming ahead where you might want to go out and check some of these places out. Explore them and know that you're experiencing places along the path. And now here in Thompson, we actually have, this was a busy place in travel because there were a number of trails that came through Thompson. And I'll go down from the bottom here is the Middle Post Road going over Thompson Hill and on towards Douglas. The path that Larned mapped out running across to Woodstock. And then there was another trail that was established as a road after the settlement of Oxford and Woodstock in 1786, or 1686, that runs through the center of Dudley and down and up over the hill from Bayview. So this was a busy place, that there were a number of trails. There wasn't just one trail, there were several. But it's believed that, the Old Connecticut Path, as Larned took the stories, came right down across Webster Lake and down to Thompson and on to Woodstock. And we'll zoom down and take a look at some of those places. To help you get a sense of where this is if you want to go out. You probably know the places and now you'll be able to say, next time I drive there, I'll know. I went out and I walked a good bit of it and marked it off with GPS, and then I was curious to see how well what I found might match with Larned, and it's pretty darn close. Going over Cordis Hill, down, I gotta say this right, Capitulic. Okay, I got that right, I'm good. Brickyard Road, down to the river, and then across the Thompson Woods, and we'll see that a little more in a moment. By extension, it ran right up towards the area where the Narrows is in Webster Lake. The route here, and this is the route of the Woodstock-Oxford Road, is the one that the Connecticut Historical Commission and the folks over in Woodstock would say that was the path. So we have some variations, but that path is all paved. This, you have quite a few places that are still wild. And one of the nicest ones is right down by Brickyard Road at the Nahacko River, which is the area I believe was the crossing place on the river. If you go out there on Brickyard Road, there's a big meadow along the river. And if we go down to the water, you'll see the conditions are perfect for walking across because it's wide, it's gravel bottomed, and the banks, if you look at the banks would be low, you can step in and out of the river fairly easy. And up above there is the mill, and one of the beautiful things that I happened to be there at the right time is the cascade on Brook, right below the mill. And this is probably a 10-minute walk from Brickyard Road to the cascade, and there's a fisherman's trail that goes right up along the river. So it's a great place to explore, and it is within the Corps of Engineers land. Now, one of the things that I was surprised at when I looked at the geological survey maps was this area of the Thompson Woods is a great forest, but there's a network of roads that went across it, and there's history of travel across there, and it matches with Larned's route running down across, that you can walk the 3 miles through the woods there, about an hour and a half from the river on up to Sunexit Meadow. And it's just a wonderful place to cross. It isn't posted, thank goodness. And it looks as though folks have gone in there if you snowmobile or travel in that way or hunt. There are folks who are probably saying, I know just what you're talking about. But it's one of those marvelous places that's still preserved along the way. And another view of this, just so you get some sense of it, going across this great greenery of the Thompson Woods. As compared with driving up Payne District Road from Fabian, nothing compares with the experience of walking up from the Nahacko River across the Sunexit Meadows. The next one is up in the green in Woodstock, and we will be doing a special program with Woodstock Historical Society and the New England Historic Genealogical Society coming up in August. I'll have more information posted, but it's a beautiful place for a walk where you don't have to work too hard. And going out to Pulpit Rock on Pulpit Rock Road, I thought that that was the route that Larned had mapped. But when I looked at her map compared to, this is the route that the Connecticut Historic Commission and the folks in Woodstock identified, and I had been using. Looking at Larned's route, she was somewhat different, so I broke that down to take a little bit closer look, and it really wasn't on Pulpit Rock Road, but there's a wonderful place off of Pulpit Rock Road that you can go. And I recommend if you haven't been to Pulpit Rock Road, take a drive up there. And it's in the Rappaport Spalding Preserve. It's owned by the Women Land Trust. And if you walk in there, it's just wonderful range road running along the beaver pond. And the beavers there have taken over the old road and they built their dam. Actually, it's built right on top of one of those old stone bridges. So they've recycled what, it's kind of the power of nature taking over from man. Man came over and built the bridges, the beavers taken them back. A little further on in Woodstock and in Eastford is the Crystal Pond Camp Nahacko Preserve. And the trail ran just south of Crystal Pond, and it's a wonderful place to walk down to the pond. The pond has some history of being a native gathering place along the path. Moving further west from Crystal Pond, Warren showed a prairie going pretty much straight across Bigelow Brook, Boston Hollow, and up over Westford Hill and on towards the Wilmington. And there's some really wonderful places that you can visit today that are along this route. I had some help because David Chisholm, who was a longtime resident of Ashford, took Larned's map and then went out and took the local history in Ashford and mapped more specifically where the path was going across Eastford and Ashford. So we're actually able to pin down places and locations that are, when you're walking on them, you can say, yeah, you're really walking on what we think is the path. And the Connecticut Historical Commission, when I read their report, actually followed pretty closely with this. And one of those places, it goes into Yale Forest along Walker Road. And it's a marvelous area, significant in the history with the Chisholm brothers. They described going to school in the 1870s up there on Walker Road. There was a schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse. And the thing that they described, Charles Chisholm described, was they walked down the hill from their farm at Axe Factory and now in Ashford. They crossed the bridge over Bigelow Brook, but just up the stream were these stones, and there's one of them remaining here. There was a set of those, just like that, going across the Bigelow Brook, that they said they used to walk across when they'd go to school. And he said this tradition was that those were placed along the path to help make crossing easy. And their farm, the Chisholm farm, the brothers, lived just a little bit further up from Bigelow Brook in Ashford. And if you go there now and you look up the hill from Eastford Road, you can look up the hill, and I ventured up, and hidden at the top of the hill there, right along the edge, is this ancient roadway that's showing up as likely the path. So roads shifted to make them easier. When we have real transport, when it wasn't a bridle path, we took it down from the hills. There's a beautifully preserved section up there. And we have another event coming up in June with the Connecticut Horseman Park Association, a walk, that will take a group, we're going to take a group down into a section right here on the Connecticut Path. You'll be walking on the Nahacko Trail that's a portion of the Connecticut Path. So it's been in use likely for 400 or more years as a trail. And the marathon now runs up there. And here's some of the places that's just marvelous. And so we're going to take a group and do this about a 2.5-hour walk into an area here. A little further over, along the path across Nahacko State Forest is the marker for the trail. And it lists John Oldham, who went down to Wethersfield, and was regarded as one of the first to go down to Connecticut along this path. John Wareham, who led the congregation from Dorchester to Windsor, and Thomas Hooker. There were other groups that came down at different times, but these were some of the key people in that history. When I looked at the Connecticut Historical Commission, they were darn close to everything that I was doing. It's nice to find out after the fact that they agreed with me. They followed the Nahacko Trail as I did, but I followed the description by Charles Chisholm and the map by David Chisholm across Grass Hill on up to Westford Hill. The commission differed here. It wasn't by much. They said, well, we'll just follow the Nipmuc Trail and then cut over, and then we rejoined. We were back on the same place. So again, we're probably within half a mile of each other. And if you've ever been out on the Blue Blaze Trail, the Nipmuc Trail up in that area, you're very close to being on the Connecticut Path. On June 8th, we're doing another walk at Fleegle Farm, which is a Joshua Trust land. Very short walk. This will be a family type walk. And it's a marvelous, beautiful area. We'll go down Holy Road, down to Milton Brook, where the path crossed, and into the glade. There's a fern glade there. It's just a marvelous place to walk on a boardwalk. It's a family type walk. And we'll also be going just a short distance down the Holy Road, which is likely the line of the Old Connecticut Path to the Langhammer Conservation Land owned by the Ashford Conservation Commission. So this is an event that would be more family oriented. It would be on June 8th. It'll be about a 2-hour event, and it's easier walking. Again, this will be posted on the website, so I can share that. And Langhammer is another one of those glorious places right on the path. The last of the places in Newton County here, or just over the line here, is at the Ruby Fenton Park in Wilmington. You come down along the Connecticut Path into Ruby Fenton Park, and it's a wonderful place to walk. With the pond, the trails that are running around the pond, and this is the roadway that is likely the course of the path. Now, I've told you a lot about places you can go, and we've got the good weather coming. So there's a chance for you to actually get out and go to some of these places. And to make it a little easier for you after you leave here, who would have imagined that to Google would become a legitimate verb? Well, just Google it. If you Google Old Connecticut Path Tours and Walks, it will lead you to a link that will take you down to a page that I've set up that has driving tours. You can drive pretty much from Webster. I've got a tour that starts at Webster, comes across here, on up to Woodstock. Tours that continue along the country roads that cross and intersect with the path, all the way down to the Wilmington and all the way on down to Windsor. So you can go out and do some, if you just want to do a nice road tour, and there's some other nice branches, but then there are also these walks, and there's some guides that are online with guide maps and links, so you get a GPS guide and a map if you want to go explore. And I encourage you to, because that's a way for people to really get involved in discovering and taking an active role in history and helping to preserve this. Now, Ellen Larned, as you've seen, this has largely followed what she mapped and recorded 140 years ago in her map of ancient Windham County and in her history of Windham County. So, in addition to her place in Thompson's history, she has this remarkable, enduring place in the story of the path, and helping us to appreciate the places along the path today. So I do hope you'll go out and do some exploration. This is more recent work because since I've discovered and read the Historic Commission report, I was feeling really good that I discovered the known, which, if you're going to set out to discover something, forget about discovering unknown things. Try to discover known things, and then you'll feel a lot more successful. We were on track right up to about the center of Wilmington, or below Woodford Hill in Wilmington. And then they took a turn, and I said, "What are you doing?" they said in their report, this is a little further out, they said, we're going to use Matthias Spies, who wrote the history of Manchester, and he said, the Connecticut Path only could have come. We started by saying it might have come through the center of Manchester, and then it became the only possible way it could have come, and the only way that people would have known to come would have been through Bolton Notch and on through Manchester Center. So they took that and they said, well, okay, we've got that. So we'll kind of draw a line, even though we don't have any historical record or roads or things that would connect it. It's just, if he was right and they're right, then we would have had to kind of go across Holland this way and Coventry and then join up at Bolton Notch. And I think they kind of misunderstood what Spies was saying, because Spies, if he were alive, when he was alive, and Harold Ayers said the path comes down to about there. He was furious. It was very nasty, the words that were coming out of his mouth. That just was impossible. There was no trail there. There was nothing that would justify that. He knew the answer. His answer was, and he recorded this and was very proud of the map of native trails, this was the Connecticut Path. And that was the only possible way. If you were going to Windsor or Wethersfield or Hartford, that was the only way that people would know at that time. So they jumped onto something that I think didn't make sense. But fortunately, Spies, when I started reading his letters and things, and he calmed down in his letters, he actually was a pretty cool guy. Amateur historian, archaeologist. He described a way to get to Windsor in the first ferry. And he said, assuming these people, Woodward and Safford, went from Providence to Windsor, they would have gone this way. And he described it in a way that you can actually go out and map it out. I'll share that with you in just a moment. But I have to make some true confessions and all this, and figuring out one of my 500 ancestors plus is the leader of this survey that was commissioned by the Massachusetts and David Woodward. And I uncovered the maps down at the Mass Archives, and this was 1642 with a survey team measuring distances with a chain, and his map, we moved to map the distance is 64 miles. When we map it today, it's 63 miles. So 300 and some years later, you have to say, gee, I mean, she identified a whole bunch of landmarks along the way. The folks down at the Pequot Museum were really thrilled when I shared the map with them because they'd never seen it. But looking in more detail on another manuscript copy of the map, they recorded it was 17 miles from the Windsor Ferry to the Wilmington. And when I measured it, it was 16.3 miles. So there wasn't a real question. It wasn't assuming. There was great controversy. Woodward and Safford were considered to be frauds or drunks, that they couldn't have done this. The evidence is quite to the contrary. It was very accurate. That the distance from the Safford, from the ferry to the Willimantic River was very precise. And the native trail that Spies described, you can actually follow on road today pretty closely. And he described that as a native trail, as part of the Providence Path. The people coming from Providence would have gone up over the hill there. So he described something that was nowhere in the Connecticut Historical Commission report, that there would have been a trail right where they crossed it. There was an alternative. And in looking at the history, in Holland, there are all the things that the Historical Commission couldn't find going from Wilmington to Bolton Notch. Wonderful aerial photos from the time of the early 30s that showed an ancient road, and the maps going back to 1850, the road drops off the map. So it was a very early road going up over to the Scungamog River, and then Torrey Road going beyond. And I went out to check this out, because showing up whether there's something there. When you get to the Willimantic River, It's very much like looking at the Winnebago River to cross in that area. And as you go uphill, there's this road that now has a no trespassing sign and goes up the hill. When we look at it from above, from there, going up to the edge, the old road goes right up through the land bordering Nahacko State Forest. When you go up into Nahacko and you look back at it, you can see very clearly it's well-preserved roadway. And it gradually becomes more wild as you go up towards and it crosses the Interstate 84. So if you've gone I-84 in that area, you can say, well, I was on the Connecticut Path for about a second. You cut right in through there. And up to the area of the state police barracks and across Nahacko. This is all in Nahacko State Forest, so it's preserved. And there's a piece of it that a Tallinn resident, Madeline Regan, her family owned this land going back to the 1890s, and her grandparents walked down following the road. She said, well, they used to walk down the Wilmington River following the road. And the piece in her land, she wanted it to be preserved because when they did a land survey, the surveyor said, this is the ancient road. And this was likely the path that Hooker followed, the Connecticut Path. So we had that, and she subsequently gave an easement to Joshua's trust in the hopes it would be preserved for future generations. In my travels, a Tallinn resident came forward, Tim Gaudier, and he's compiled 6,000 deeds going back to the early settlement with plots. And he's able to overlay where the roads were, where the trails were. And he found, by going back all those years, coming up, the path came up over Torrey Road towards Tallinn Green, up a little bit uphill from the modern highway to what's now Payne's Pond, and it split with the trail going off to Windsor through Elliott. Trail coming down the hill towards and on its Vernon. And he uncovered a third one that left the green and went up over Old Post Road and up the hill there, and around to Gage's Brook, which runs down to the Nahacko River. So in Tallinn, there's all the evidence that wasn't there that the Connecticut Historic Commission said someone should find in that connection between Wilmington and Bolton Notch. There seems to be a direct connection from the route up to Wilmington, across on down to Vernon. And coming up smelling like a rose is Matthias Spies, even though he said some terrible, nasty things. He really was quite helpful. He identified what probably is the summer way. That was his way down on the Connecticut Path that way, which is now a highway. And he also said there was another trail, called the Nahacko Path that the natives followed. And taking that from his map, it runs right through Tallinn on up to National Pond and up towards Sturbridge. And he said, if they did actually go to Tallinn, they would have just come down the Nahacko Trail, which actually meets at the same spot as his route to cross into Hartford. So when we take his route and lay it on there, we see he's provided a solution here coming across Tallinn that we have evidence from the trails and evidence from deeds, and his history and description of a native trail that ran down between the Nahacko and the Nahacko rivers on down to Hartford, and branches that could occur going off to Windsor and Wethersfield. So that leads us down to our conclusion here, because there we see the place where Spies, in his wisdom, brought both of those trails together at this crossing point. And we can see, as we cross into the city and we visit the old burial ground, it brings up questions about the stories that those early pioneers must have thought of and passed on to their children. And as I look at this and in my travels, because I was up in the hills so much, it really was awe-inspiring when I finally got to the Connecticut Valley and I had this kind of vista where you just go, this is an incredible valley. Those folks, they must have been going 10 miles a day through the wilderness going, my God, what have we gotten ourselves into? And here, when you start to see, and there are places you can actually look down the valley to Hartford, and you can look out here across to Windsor, that you go, my God, what a wonderful, beautiful place that we've come to. And they must have experienced this somewhat as arriving, I think, in the Promised Land, a place of great wonder and beauty. And I got to give credit here to Leslie Sweetman, who's from this area, who's done some wonderful photography. And I just love this picture, so I think that out. So going on back to what happened to their story, they had lots of, you think of, this is a marvelous story of the journey and the things that people did when they got here, the effect it's had on America. Why aren't we hearing more about it? Well, I have to think that they had children, and they had their children and their descendants. They didn't stay in Connecticut, they moved on. And as they moved on, they moved back into the center of Connecticut. They moved up with my family up to Vermont, along the Connecticut River. They gradually expanded with the westward expansion of America and the migration and settlement of the West. And along the way, I'm sure that at those fires, the family stories were being retold. And it wasn't the story of crossing the ocean and coming out of oppression in England. It was the story of coming from Connecticut to Vermont. It was the story of coming from Connecticut to New York, and from New York to the Great Plains and on to the West. And they were passing on their own stories of their own hardships and what it took to survive and prosper. But in that story, I do believe there was another story that was grafted in there, a kind of moral story, to impart a lesson that when I think of in my travels, that what sustained these folks, what kept them going across the ocean and across the wilderness at that time, what kept them going? Why didn't they just stay in Cambridge, where it would have been comfortable and their real estate values would be quite high now? Descendants would be well off. And as I did this, it was right in front of me as I started looking at the motto for Connecticut that was adopted by these people in 1640. When I messed with the Latin, it's been a while. He who transplants sustains. And I started looking at the symbolism of this, and the symbolism of the vines is the tribes of Israel coming out of Egypt and being transplanted. And so there was another group that had to answer the question, well, what should we tell our children to give them the strength to go on and explain what we've done? And I found this in Deuteronomy, which would have been well known, I suspect, to Thomas Hooker and the other ministers, and would have been shared with them, talking about, what shall we tell our children? Well, tell your children that God brought you out of bondage and oppression, delivered you to the promised land, to the land promised to your ancestors, and that will sustain you there, sustain your faith. God will sustain you there. The story of the Exodus. And as I looked at the story of the Puritans coming to New England, they very much identified themselves with that story. And there's no group that more strongly we can identify with that than the groups like Thomas Hooker and the Hooker congregation that came out of the bondage and oppression in England, came to America, traveled together as a congregation through the wilderness to establish a new order here in Connecticut. And to establish, as Thomas Hooker pointed out, using their gift from God, they created the law of their own community and fundamental orders. So I see them as being sustained by this deep belief that they were here for a divine purpose, and they were fulfilling that in their journey. And that sense of there is a power that delivers you to this land, and that a power that will sustain you. You take that story and you lay it over generations, telling their children the stories of their travels in America. And I say it becomes part of the American story. The story of America is that place of the promised land, the place of promise and opportunity. And you think of the power of that story, it still draws people here to America today. As difficult as we see ourselves in times, the power of the story of America, there are people across the world who still yearn to come here and be part of that story. And part of the greatness of America is that you have an opportunity to be part of it when you come. As many of our ancestors did later, in later generations, as they escaped oppression and sought opportunity. So there is a real story of power that I believe carries on to this day here in Connecticut. That our story of the Connecticut Path is more than a story about places, although wonderful places that we're so fortunate to have preserved for today and for future generations. But it's a story about people and how they've shaped our lives even today. So as I come to a conclusion here, I hope that you'll take opportunity as you leave here and over the course of a wonderful, warm summer, that you'll take opportunity to go out and explore the byways that are near here and know that you're exploring the places of the pioneers. That you take a chance to get out of the car at some of the places along the way so that you can actually walk and begin to let your imagination go free to experience and think of how they must have seen this world and see it with new eyes and see it with some wonder. And I hope you'll have an opportunity to pass it on to your neighbors and your friends and your family and say, come on, take a look at this. Because it's important that the places and the story be preserved and passed down. That's our place in being able to take the history and the story of Thompson, the story of Connecticut, and the story of America, and making sure that it stays alive. So I want to thank you all, and thank the folks here in the Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to share this wonderful story with you. I wish you well in your travels. I hope you do go explore. But I do again want to thank Joe and the Society of all. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website